Give us the pitch that you're going to make when you testify there at the Commerce Department.
Well, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be on the show. Look, we will be saying that, in our view, there is absolutely no justification under grounds of national security for contemplating imposing tariffs on auto and auto part imports. This is simply, I think, under no circumstances can you seriously argue that this poses a threat to national security. Economically, we think the auto industry is actually in good shape. Imports do not pose a major threat. They contribute to consumer choice. And indeed, European companies are heavily invested here, creating many thousands of hundreds of thousands of jobs. And finally, this would be a massive escalation of a looming trade conflict, as you just saw in your earlier reports. This would deal with maybe as much as $300 billion in trade. And if there is retaliation, this would be a serious escalation of existing trade conflict, which would be to nobody's benefit and to the detriment of us all.
Well, and Ambassador, one of the things you point out, which I find so interesting, is that over the past few years, we've seen such a shift here in the United States in terms of manufacturing of especially European cars to the southeastern United States. You look at Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina. Specifically, this is a significant number of jobs we're talking about here. What's the risk there if, in fact, these tariffs go forward?
Well, I think these investments do create, as you say, we reckon about 120,000 jobs directly and maybe as many as 420,000 in the dealerships and downstream industry. I would also point out that they do an enormous amount for the skill base of the American workforce in those regions, because these are highly skilled jobs and people are trained on the job to acquire those skills. I think the risk is that if you have an increase of tariffs on parts and cars, it considerably disrupts the whole supply chain. I mean, as some of the commentators were saying earlier, companies rely on parts which come from different parts of the world. They're assembled here, turned into cars, which are then frequently exported from the U.S., including back to Europe. So I think the minute you start putting tariffs on cars or on car parts, you will have a massive disruption of the supply chain, and this could seriously disrupt the production of these investments here in the United States, as well as imports.
Ambassador, nevertheless, though, U.S. charges 2.5% tariff on cars that are imported versus EU levies about a 10%. On a number-to-number basis, that's not equal. So knowing President Trump that he probably won't be backing down, what is the EU willing to offer?
Well, Alex, I think you're correct that for certain types of cars in Europe, the tariff is 10% and 2.5% here. For other types of cars, which are an important segment of the U.S. market, SUVs and light trucks, your tariffs here are 25%, and the tariffs in Europe are much lower. So I think just isolating one tariff line does not give you a true picture. But having said that, we are more than willing to sit down with this administration, figure out where the problems are, and how can we find constructive ways of going forward, including the possibility of reducing or eliminating tariffs on industrial products. This was something we were negotiating with the previous administration through TTIP. The important thing is not to do this in a climate of hostility or confrontation, and also to be clear about the reciprocity and the mutual benefit of any arrangement which we enter into.
Have you spoken to European car companies, and do you get a sense of the supply and demand dynamic if we do get these tariffs going forward, how quickly that might affect their production, how quickly that affects their sales? What's your read-through?
Well, I think it's always difficult to predict with precision how this will play out. It's certainly going to increase the cost of cars to consumers here. That's going to affect dealerships. It's going to affect the car parts. Therefore, that's going to affect the assembly industry. So I think there will be generally a slowdown in the car market, including, by the way, for domestic U.S. manufacturers who are equally concerned about this. An important point to bear in mind is that nobody in the American industry is asking for these tariffs or thinks they would be a good idea. I'll be testifying today at the Department of Commerce, but look at the long list of other American domestic interests who will be testifying, also asking that the administration not take this very dramatic step.
So, Ambassador, while we have you, I can't help but ask you about last week. Just a week ago, the President of the United States was over in Europe, in Brussels, and then in the UK before on to Helsinki. Obviously, what is the state of the EU-US relationship at that level coming out of those meetings last week?
Look, we understand that President Trump has been elected on a platform of feeling that the set of international relations which the U.S. have don't always work in U.S. interests. We are partners and allies and friends of the United States. I think we're willing to have an honest discussion about how we can do that. Last week there was a discussion in NATO about defense expenditure. We will be talking next week when President Juncker is here about the trade relationship. So we understand that President Trump has a slightly different view of the world than previous administrations, but we believe that the partnership between the United States and the European Union, both economic and security, is absolutely vital to the interests of both of us, and we have every interest in trying to find solutions to such problems as there may be.